The late summer sun bathed the town of Pine Hill in a warm, golden light, casting long shadows across its quiet streets. Lena and Marcus Hayes sat in their car, taking in the view of their new neighborhood. Pine Hill looked like a picture-perfect town, pristine colonial homes, picket fences, and children playing on manicured lawns. It was exactly the kind of place they had envisioned for a fresh start. "This is it," Lena said, her voice brimming with a mix of excitement and relief. She leaned forward, studying the cozy Victorian house with its wide bay windows and welcoming wraparound porch. "It's everything we wanted. Marcus, I can't believe we're finally here." Marcus smiled, reaching over to give her hand a gentle squeeze. "We made it, Lena. New town, new opportunities. I think we'll be happy here." But even as he spoke, Marcus couldn't shake a strange feeling. Perhaps it was the stillness, or the way a few neighbors peered out their windows, eyeing them with something just short of curiosity. They were likely just unused to seeing new faces in town. He reasoned it would take time to build connections and settle in. As Marcus parked the car in the driveway, Lena wasted no time jumping out, her curly hair catching the breeze. She ran her hand along the house's painted porch railing, marveling at the charm and history embedded in every detail. "Can't you just picture us here? Me grading papers by the window, and you working on your projects." Marcus chuckled as he stepped out, his tall frame moving with a quiet authority. Despite his casual appearance, there was an air of confidence about him that hinted at his background in law enforcement. He had been asked by the town council to keep his new position a secret until the official announcement next month, a strategic move to allow him to observe the town's true nature. Their neighbor, an elderly woman with a kind smile, made her way over, carrying a dish covered with a checker cloth. "Welcome to Pine Hill," she greeted, extending the dish toward Lena. "I'm Ethel, your neighbor from across the street. Brought you my famous blueberry pie, kind of a Pine Hill tradition for newcomers." Lena beamed, accepting the pie gratefully. "That's so thoughtful, Ethel. Thank you. I'm Lena Hayes, and this is my husband, Marcus." "Welcome, Lena." "Marcus." Ethel's gaze flickered toward Marcus, and her warm expression faltered ever so slightly. "And what brings you both to our little town?" "Marcus works in public service," Lena replied smoothly, a practiced response for this brief period of secrecy. "And I'll be teaching at Pine Hill Elementary." Ethel's smile returned, though it seemed more guarded now. "That's wonderful, but you may want to keep an eye out in certain parts of town, especially with the local law enforcement. Well, they have their way of doing things." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Not everyone gets treated the same, if you understand what I mean." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but kept his tone neutral. "I appreciate the warning, Ethel. Change can be hard for people." "I know. Yes. Well," Ethel replied, looking uncomfortable. "Hopefully things might change with the new chief they're bringing in soon. Rumor has it he's someone who's seen the world beyond Pine Hill." But until then, her voice trailed off, and she glanced around as if expecting someone to overhear. Lena exchanged a glance with Marcus, her expression a mix of concern and determination. After Ethel had gone, they stood on the porch in silence, taking in their new surroundings. "I suppose every town has its secrets," Lena murmured, casting a last look at Ethel's retreating figure. "Maybe," Marcus replied, his gaze steady on the quiet streets. "But we're here to build something good. This is our fresh start. Lena, together, we can make it work." But as they unpacked and settled into their new home, they had no idea just how much of Pine Hill's hidden darkness would soon come to light, and how it would test every ounce of strength and resilience they possessed. The following morning, Lena awoke early, excitement bubbling in her chest as she prepared for her first day at Pine Hill Elementary. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft orange glow across their bedroom. But Lena was already up, carefully choosing her outfit and gathering her lesson plans. She wanted to make a good impression on her students and hoped to create a safe, welcoming space where every child felt seen and valued. Marcus was in the kitchen, brewing a fresh pot of coffee when Lena joined him, already dressed and ready. "Nervous?" he asked, pouring her a steaming mug. "A little," she admitted, her eyes bright with anticipation, but mostly excited. I've had a good feeling about this. Marcus, this school, this town, it's exactly where I want to be. Where we're supposed to be. Marcus watched her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He admired her unwavering optimism, her passion for teaching, and her fierce belief in the goodness of people. If anyone could break down barriers and build bridges, it was Lena. I'm proud of you. Lena, he said, leaning in to give her a quick kiss. And I know your students are going to be just as taken with you as I am. She laughed, nudging him playfully before taking a sip of her coffee. All right, Mr. Hayes, don't go overboard. They're just kids. After breakfast, Marcus walked Lena to the door, watching as she got in her car and waved goodbye, her smile lingering in his mind long after she'd driven off. The day was already growing warmer, the air thick with a late summer humidity that hung over the town like a heavy blanket. Marcus had plans of his own. Today, he would explore Pine Hill, get a lay of the land, and observe the town without drawing too much attention. As he walked through the quiet streets, he noticed how every house looked like it had been pulled from a postcard: trim lawns, painted fences, and flowers blooming in every garden. But beneath the surface, he could sense an unease, a tension that lurked just out of sight. He stopped at the local diner, a small, retro-style place with a neon sign that buzzed softly in the morning light. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, and a few locals were seated at booths, chatting and reading newspapers. Marcus took a seat at the counter, nodding politely to the waitress as she approached. Morning, she greeted with a practiced smile, pulling a notepad from her apron. What can I get for you? Just coffee. Thanks, Marcus replied, scanning the room casually. He noticed how the other patrons glanced at him curiously, their conversations quieting slightly as they took in the unfamiliar face. As the waitress poured his coffee, she lowered her voice. You're new in town, aren't you? Just moved here yesterday, Marcus confirmed, taking a sip of the strong, bitter brew. My wife and I are looking for a fresh start. The waitress glanced around, then leaned in a little closer. Well, I hope you both settle in all right. Just keep your head down, okay? Not everyone here is as welcoming as they seem. Marcus's eyes narrowed, a flicker of concern crossing his features. What do you mean? She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was listening. There's been talk, you know? Some people around here don't take kindly to newcomers, especially ones who don't fit their idea of who should be living in Pine Hill. Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd expected some small-town quirks, maybe a bit of old-fashioned thinking. But this was something else entirely. Thanks for the heads up, he said, his tone measured. The waitress offered a quick, sympathetic smile before straightening up and hurrying back to the kitchen. Marcus finished his coffee in silence, his mind racing with questions. What had they really walked into here? And how far did this quiet hostility go? Meanwhile, at Pine Hill Elementary, Lena was already busy preparing her classroom when the first students began to trickle in. She greeted each child with a warm smile, learning their names and helping them find their seats. Her classroom was decorated with colorful posters, a cozy reading corner, and a large bulletin board with the words "Everyone belongs here" displayed proudly in the center. As the children settled in, Lena noticed a young black boy sitting by himself near the back of the room. He seemed withdrawn, his eyes downcast as he fiddled with his notebook. Hi there, Lena said, making her way over to him. What's your name? Jaden, he mumbled, not meeting her gaze. Well, Jaden, it's nice to meet you. I'm Mrs. Hayes, and I'm really glad you're here. I hope you'll feel at home in our classroom. Jaden looked up briefly, a glimmer of surprise in his eyes. Thanks, he murmured before returning to his notebook. Lena's heart ached for the boy. She couldn't help but wonder if he had faced the same kind of prejudice that Marcus and she had begun to sense. But she pushed the thought aside, determined to make her classroom a place where every child felt valued and respected. The morning went smoothly, with Lena leading her students through introductions, a few icebreaker games, and a reading activity. By lunchtime, she felt a sense of accomplishment, confident that she was making a difference, however small. But as the children filed out for lunch, Lena heard the quiet murmurings of two teachers passing by her door. They paused just outside, speaking in hushed tones. New teacher. And she's, well, let's just say she's not what we're used to around here. Wonder how long she'll last. Lena's chest tightened as she caught the subtle implications in their words. She had expected some challenges, but not this kind of passive hostility from her own colleagues. Shaking it off, she resolved not to let their words get to her. She was here to teach, to make a difference in her students' lives, and she wouldn't let anyone's prejudice stand in her way. Back at the diner, Marcus paid for his coffee and stepped out into the blazing midday sun. His mind was racing, piecing together the vague warnings and the lingering glances he'd received. He was no stranger to tough situations, but this felt different, a hidden threat, cloaked in polite smiles and quiet words. He walked back toward their new house, his mind churning. They had moved here for a fresh start, but it was beginning to feel like Pine Hill was anything but welcoming. That evening, as Lena and Marcus sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, they shared their experiences from the day. Lena spoke of her students, her excitement for the school year, and the lingering tension she'd felt among some of her colleagues. There's something off about this place. Marcus, she admitted, her gaze distant. It's like everyone's polite, but it's just a mask. Underneath, there's something cold. Marcus nodded, his expression grim. I know what you mean. I felt it too. And it's not just the people. There's a history here, a history they don't want us to see. They fell into a contemplative silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. For the first time, they questioned their decision to move to Pine Hill. But they were here now, and neither was the type to back down. They would face whatever darkness lay hidden in this town, together. As the night deepened and stars began to dot the sky, Lena and Marcus made a silent promise to each other. No matter what challenges came their way, they would stand strong. They had each other, and that was enough. Little did they know, the shadows lurking in Pine Hill were only beginning to reveal themselves, and soon, they would be forced to confront them head-on. A week passed, and Lena and Marcus had begun to settle into their routine, though the subtle undercurrent of unease never fully disappeared. Lena threw herself into her teaching, finding joy in her students' progress and the small connections she made each day. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his quiet observations around town, taking note of the way certain people cast wary glances, particularly at Lena or at families who didn't fit Pine Hill's narrow mold. It was on a Thursday afternoon that the first real confrontation with Pine Hill's darker side occurred. Marcus had decided to take a walk through Cedar Park, a sprawling green space with winding trails, shaded benches, and a playground that usually echoed with the sounds of children laughing. That afternoon, however, the park seemed unusually quiet. He strolled along one of the paths, his senses on alert, taking in his surroundings. As he approached the playground, he noticed a group of teens hanging around. They were a mix of kids, some playing basketball nearby, others chatting in clusters. Among them was Jaden, the boy Lena had mentioned from her class, sitting on a bench with a book open in his lap. He seemed lost in his reading, oblivious to the world around him. Marcus smiled to himself, appreciating the boy's focus. But before he could get any closer, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming and looked up to see two police officers approaching the playground. Both officers were tall and broad-shouldered, their movements deliberate and filled with authority. They were the kind of officers who commanded attention the moment they entered a scene. And Marcus could see by the kids' expressions that they were not welcome here. The officers walked toward Jaden, their eyes narrowing. Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched. He recognized the taller of the two. The man's name was Officer Trent Michaels, known around town for his tough demeanor and no-nonsense approach. The other was Officer Kyle Dempsey, a stockier man with a rigid, almost militaristic stance. "Hey, you there," Michaels called out to Jaden, his voice sharp and carrying an edge of accusation. Jaden looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. He quickly closed his book, clutching it tightly as the two officers advanced. "What's in that backpack?" Michaels demanded, crossing his arms. You think it's normal to sit around here, all suspicious, with your face buried in a book. Jaden stammered, his voice barely audible. I was just reading. My mom said I could stay here until she finishes work. Michaels exchanged a glance with Dempsey, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. We've got reports of kids causing trouble here. Guess we'll start with you. Jaden's face paled. He held out his book with shaking hands. I'm not causing any trouble. I promise. I'm just doing my homework. Michaels chuckled, grabbing the book from Jaden's hands and flipping through it carelessly. He barely looked at the pages before tossing it onto the ground. Homework? Huh? Sure looks like you're up to something. Marcus felt a surge of anger rise within him. He took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. Officers, is there a problem here? Both officers turned to face him, their expressions hardening. Michaels gave him a once-over, his eyes narrowing. And who might you be? Marcus Hayes, he replied smoothly. Just a concerned resident. Concerned? Huh? Michaels said, his gaze not softening. Well, we're handling an investigation here, so maybe it's best you stay out of it. Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. From where I'm standing, it looks more like harassment than an investigation. The crowd around the playground had started to grow, a mix of parents and other kids who had noticed the commotion. Some had their phones out, recording, while others whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of fear and anger. Michaels noticed this, his jaw tightening. He looked back at Jaden, then at the crowd, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. Fine, kid, get out of here and watch yourself next time. We're always around, keeping an eye on things. Jaden hesitated, his eyes flickering between the officers and Marcus, before finally grabbing his book and rushing off toward the park's exit. His shoulders hunched and his face flushed with humiliation. Michaels turned back to Marcus, his eyes cold. You do well to mind your own business here. Mr. Hayes, some people don't appreciate outsiders stirring things up. I'm not here to stir things up, Officer Michaels, Marcus replied, his voice steady and unyielding. I'm here to make sure people are treated fairly. Everyone in this community deserves that much. Don't you think? Michaels sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. This community has a certain way of doing things. Outsiders don't get to come in and start changing the rules. He gave Marcus one last hard look before nodding to Dempsey. The two officers turned and walked back toward their patrol car, their steps heavy with frustration. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus noticed a few people lingering, casting him grateful glances. He nodded in acknowledgement, silently affirming that he understood their relief, their quiet appreciation, but it wasn't enough to soothe the simmering anger within him. He knew the moment he returned home that he'd have to tell Lena everything that had happened. She would be furious for Jaden, for the other kids, for anyone in Pine Hill who'd been forced to live under this kind of silent oppression. That evening, when Marcus recounted the incident, Lena was indeed furious. Her face flushed as she listened, eyes blazing with anger. It's not right, Marcus, she said, her voice quivering. Jaden is one of the sweetest kids in my class. He's just a boy. How can they treat him like that? Marcus reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I know, Lena. Believe me, I know. But change doesn't happen overnight. Right now, I have to watch, document, and wait. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Lena's eyes softened as she looked at him, her hand covering his. I just wish we could do more. These kids, they deserve to feel safe. They will, Marcus promised, his voice filled with conviction. I won't let this continue. Once I'm officially in charge, things are going to change. I'll make sure of it. As they sat together in the fading light, they both knew that their lives in Pine Hill would never be the peaceful retreat they had envisioned. They had stepped into a place haunted by unspoken fears and buried resentment, a place that would test their courage and resolve at every turn. But they were here now, and they would face it together. Unbeknownst to them, the quiet resistance they felt building within themselves was mirrored in the hearts of others throughout Pine Hill. The town's facade was beginning to crack, and the light of truth was seeping through. And as Lena and Marcus prepared to confront the coming challenges, they felt a growing sense of purpose. They were no longer simply residents of Pine Hill. They were part of something much larger, a movement stirring quietly in the shadows, ready to rise. Days turned into weeks, and the unsettling undercurrent in Pine Hill only grew more evident. Lena continued to face subtle hostility at the school, where whispers and glances followed her through the halls. She tried to focus on her students, pouring her heart into her lessons and creating a classroom that felt like a sanctuary. But each day, the strain of being an outsider took its toll. One afternoon, after a long day of teaching, Lena walked to her car, eager to get home and leave the day behind her. She was carrying a stack of graded papers when she noticed something strange, a small, crumpled piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, she unfolded it. The note was short and hastily written, "Watch yourself. Pine Hill isn't for people like you." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She looked around the empty parking lot, her heart pounding. The threat was subtle, but the message was clear. Taking a deep breath, she tucked the note into her bag, determined not to let fear overtake her. She had Marcus, and she had her purpose in this town. They were here to stay. That night, over dinner, she shared the incident with Marcus. His face grew tense as he listened, his usual calm replaced with a protective anger. "We knew this place had its problems," he said, his voice low, "but I didn't expect it to be this hostile. Are you sure you're all right, Lena? I can talk to the school principal if you want." She shook her head, forcing a smile. "I can handle it. Besides, we're here to bring change, right? They won't scare me off that easily." But Marcus's concern lingered. He could see the weight she carried and knew the town's hostility ran deep. And though he kept his position as the soon-to-be police chief a secret, each encounter only fueled his resolve to bring reform to Pine Hill. The weekend came, and Marcus suggested they take a walk together through town. "Let's get a feel for things," he said. "See what this place really looks like when people think they aren't being watched." Lena agreed, grateful for the chance to unwind and spend time together. They strolled through the heart of Pine Hill, passing by the local shops and cafes. On the surface, everything seemed idyllic. Friendly neighbors chatting on sidewalks, children playing in yards. But there was an unspoken divide, a tension that clung to the air. As they walked, they spotted a group of teenagers gathered at the entrance to a small alleyway off Main Street. Marcus recognized Jaden among them, standing with his arms crossed, his expression guarded. His friend group was a mix of kids from different backgrounds, but Marcus noticed that most of the other teens kept their distance, casting wary glances their way. Curious, Marcus and Lena paused to watch. At that moment, two police officers, Michaels and Dempsey, pulled up in their patrol car. The officers stepped out, their presence instantly casting a shadow over the group of teens. Michaels approached Jaden, his hand resting on his belt. "Haven't we had this talk before? Son, loitering isn't allowed. Maybe you all should go home before you get into any trouble." Jaden's shoulders tensed, but he kept his voice steady. "We're just hanging out. We're not bothering anyone." Dempsey scoffed, stepping closer. "Hanging out? Huh? Funny how every time we see you kids around, there's trouble." Lena instinctively moved forward, but Marcus placed a gentle hand on her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he murmured. "Let's see how this plays out." Jaden's friends were starting to back away, clearly intimidated by the officers. Jaden held his ground, his gaze unyielding. "We're just talking. Officer Michaels, we're not doing anything wrong." Michaels smirked, crossing his arms. "I'd watch that attitude if I were you. It can get you into a lot of trouble." At that, Lena couldn't hold back any longer. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out with authority. "Is there a problem here, officers?" Both Michaels and Dempsey turned, momentarily surprised to see her standing there. Michael's eyes narrowed as he recognized her. "Mrs. Hayes, is it? I didn't realize you had an interest in law enforcement matters." Lena kept her gaze steady. "I have an interest in making sure people are treated fairly. Jaden is one of my students. He's a good kid." Dempsey snorted. "Maybe you don't know him as well as you think. 'Cause like him well." They tend to cause problems. Marcus stepped up beside Lena, his expression unreadable. I think that's enough. Officers, I'm sure these kids aren't doing anything wrong. The officers exchanged a glance, annoyance flickering in their eyes. Michaels took a step back, clearly irritated. Fine, just know we're keeping an eye on things. Some people around here like order. Makes things easier for everyone. The officers returned to their patrol car, their demeanor revealing their frustration. As they drove off, Jaden approached Marcus and Lena, gratitude and embarrassment warring on his face. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. They're always like that. Lena placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You don't deserve that. Jaden, don't ever think you do. And if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. Jaden nodded, his expression conflicted. They say people like me shouldn't even be here. That Pine Hill isn't for people like us. Marcus felt a flash of anger, but kept his tone calm. Don't listen to them. Jaden, this town belongs to everyone who calls it home. Remember that. As Jaden and his friends walked off, Marcus turned to Lena, his gaze serious. This town needs change. Lena, real change. I know, she replied, her voice filled with determination. But it's going to be a battle. Yes, Marcus agreed, and it's one I'm ready to fight. Over the next few days, the small encounters piled up, each one revealing another layer of Pine Hill's resistance to change. Lena's students whispered to her about their experiences. Parents avoided her gaze during school pickups, and Marcus continued to face thinly veiled hostility in town. But neither of them was willing to back down. Then, one evening, an incident at Pine Hill's only grocery store brought everything to a boiling point. Lena had gone to pick up a few items for dinner. She moved through the aisles, selecting vegetables and bread, when she felt eyes on her. She looked up to see a middle-aged woman glaring at her from across the produce section, her lips pressed into a thin line. Lena decided to ignore it, but as she moved closer to the register, the woman stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Excuse me, Lena said politely, trying to sidestep. The woman didn't budge. We don't need people like you here, she hissed, her voice low but dripping with venom. Why don't you take your husband and go back to where you came from? Lena's hands trembled, but she held her ground. I have every right to be here, she replied, her voice steady. This town is my home too. The woman scoffed, shaking her head. Your kind doesn't belong in Pine Hill. We don't want your influence here. A few other shoppers had paused, watching the scene with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others exchanged knowing glances. Just then, Marcus appeared, having come to help her with the groceries. He saw the confrontation and immediately moved to Lena's side, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. Is there a problem here? He asked, his tone firm. The woman shot him a disdainful look, but backed away, muttering under her breath as she left the store. Marcus turned to Lena, his expression filled with concern. Are you all right? Lena nodded, but the hurt in her eyes was clear. I'm fine, just tired of this. Marcus took her hand, his grip gentle but reassuring. We'll get through this. Lena, together. This is our town too, and they don't get to push us out. They walked out of the store together, heads held high, ignoring the whispers that followed them. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they had each other, and that was all the strength they needed. What they didn't realize was that the tide was already starting to turn. As they walked away, a few people who had witnessed the encounter felt a flicker of shame, a realization that they had stood by and done nothing. And for the first time, a spark of change began to ignite in the hearts of Pine Hill's silent majority. Lena and Marcus weren't alone in this fight. Not anymore. The tension in Pine Hill continued to build over the next few weeks. Marcus and Lena's experiences seemed to spark conversations. Some whispered in corners and others out in the open. People were starting to question things they had long ignored, and a quiet but powerful shift was taking place. The murmurs of dissatisfaction were growing louder, and it was clear to anyone paying attention that Pine Hill was on the brink of a reckoning. For Marcus, the waiting was over. The town council's official announcement came on a cool fall morning. naming him as the new chief of police. The promotion had been in the works since before his arrival, but now it felt like a victory, a chance to make the changes Pine Hill so desperately needed. At the announcement ceremony, the air was filled with anticipation. Marcus stood before the assembled crowd, his gaze steady as he addressed them. "Pine Hill is my home now," he began, his voice calm yet powerful. "And like any of you, I want it to be a place where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. As your police chief, I promise to uphold these values. We will not tolerate discrimination or intimidation, not from our officers, not from anyone. It's time for Pine Hill to be a place of fairness, not fear." His words hung in the air, resonating with those who had been quietly hoping for change. Marcus knew his speech would reach both supporters and detractors alike. But he didn't flinch. This was the beginning of his work, and he was prepared for any resistance. That same day, Lena noticed an immediate shift at school. Some teachers, inspired by Marcus's appointment and his words, approached her with renewed kindness and curiosity. A few even apologized for their previous coldness, admitting that they had harbored biases they were now questioning. Lena accepted their words graciously, hoping this was just the beginning of true understanding. One evening, as Lena was locking up her classroom, she saw Jaden waiting for her by the door. His face was troubled, his usual shy smile absent. "Mrs. Hayes, can I talk to you?" he asked quietly. "Of course, Jaden. What's on your mind?" she replied, leading him to a nearby bench. Jaden took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Some of the kids, they've been saying things about my family, that we don't belong here, that we should leave." Lena's heart ached for him. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Jaden, I'm so sorry you're going through this. But remember, you do belong here. This is your home, just as much as anyone else's. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't have a place here." Jaden nodded, but his eyes were filled with uncertainty. Lena knew that his struggle was one shared by many in Pine Hill, but she was determined to change that. She would be there for her students, and Marcus would be there for the community, paving the way for a better future. It was a brisk Saturday afternoon when Lena decided to visit the local farmers market. As she strolled through the stands, admiring the fresh produce and homemade crafts, she felt a sense of peace. For a moment, Pine Hill felt like the welcoming place she'd once hoped it would be. But that peace was shattered when she saw Michaels and Dempsey approaching, their expressions filled with thinly veiled contempt. They had been defiant ever since Marcus had taken on the role of police chief, and it was clear they were here to intimidate her. "Mrs. Hayes," Michael sneered. "Enjoying your day out?" Lena took a steadying breath, refusing to show any fear. "Yes, I am. Is there something you need, officers?" Dempsey smirked, leaning in close. "We're just making sure everyone here knows their place. It'd be a shame if people got too comfortable." Before Lena could respond, a crowd had begun to gather, watching the interaction with a mix of concern and anger. Among them were some of her students' parents, neighbors who had seen the injustice in Pine Hill and had grown tired of staying silent. A voice rang out from the crowd, clear and unwavering. "Leave her alone." Michaels and Dempsey turned, startled by the defiance. A middle-aged man stepped forward, a man Lena recognized as Mr. Thompson, the father of one of her students. He was joined by others, each one stepping forward, standing with Lena. "She's done nothing wrong." Mr. Thompson continued, "We're tired of you two harassing people. This isn't your town to control." The officers shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were outnumbered. The crowd's presence was more than just support. It was a declaration that Pine Hill's people were ready to take back their town. Michael scowled, backing away with a muttered threat. "We'll see about this." As the officers left, Lena felt a wave of relief. The community was standing with her, standing with Marcus, and they were no longer willing to accept the status quo. Over the next few months, Pine Hill began to transform, with Marcus leading the police force. He implemented new policies to ensure accountability and transparency. Michaels and Dempsey were removed from the force, their actions finally catching up with them. Other officers who had allowed discrimination to go unchecked were held accountable, and new recruits were brought in, each one committed to fair and ethical policing. Lena's classroom became a place of unity and understanding, where students learned not just academics, but empathy and respect for one another. She encouraged open conversations, helping her students see the beauty in their diversity and the strength in their shared community. Jaden flourished under her guidance, finding his voice and becoming a leader among his peers. He no longer walked through town with his head down, but instead held it high, knowing he was valued and respected. The community rallied behind Marcus and Lena, coming together to create programs and events that celebrated Pine Hill's diversity. Neighbors who had once ignored each other's presence now shared meals, conversations, and laughter. The town's reputation began to shift, no longer known for its divisions but for its unity and resilience. 1 year later, Pine Hill looked and felt like a different town. Lena and Marcus had become symbols of change, but they always reminded everyone that the transformation was a collective effort, built on the courage and determination of the entire community. On a warm autumn day, Pine Hill held a festival in the town square, celebrating the town's progress and honoring the people who had fought for justice and equality. Lena stood at the front of the crowd, Marcus by her side, as they watched Jaden step up to the microphone. "Today, we celebrate a new Pine Hill," Jaden said, his voice filled with pride. "A Pine Hill where everyone is welcome, where everyone belongs. And it's because people like Mrs. Hayes and Chief Hayes believed in us, believe in our worth, that we are here today." The crowd erupted into applause, and Lena felt a swell of emotion. Knowing the journey had been worth it, Pine Hill was no longer a place of fear and division. It had become a beacon of hope and unity, a town that had learned from its mistakes and worked to build a brighter future. As the festival continued and laughter and music filled the air, Lena and Marcus exchanged a quiet smile, their hands intertwined. They had come to Pine Hill seeking a fresh start, and in doing so, they had found their true purpose. They had become part of something greater, something that would last long after they were gone. Pine Hill had changed, and it would never go back.